There we go. Okay. Let's see. YouTube refused to connect. Okay. Edit this. Hi all. Embedding. The video isn't working on my end. Here's the link to the live. It's 6 o'clock. I did the link wrong. So that's my bad. I'm going to wait around to see if people show up. And if not, I'm still actually going to go through everything that I have planned because I think that it could be helpful. And again, you paid for the ultimate review packet. So you should get some fun extra bonuses so then you can review this whenever you need to before the test starts. But because I messed up, I'm just going to hang out for a little bit and then we'll get started. Hmm. What? Ugh. Ugh. Okay, let's figure this out. Copy. Mm. Yay! Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. That is totally my fault. I thought I was also going to figure out a way to get embedded in there, and embedding wasn't working, so that's my bad. I'll wait for just a little bit longer to see if anyone else can join, and then we'll get started. So this is also going to be a little bit of a Q&A. I I'm kind of planning on teaching a lot of the content briefly from Unit 9 because I know that this is the unit that most teachers speed through because they don't have time left. So please ask as many questions as you want to ask over the course of all of this, and I'll make sure that I answer every single one of them. And yay. Oh, okay. We'll start with that while we wait for some people to log in. So 55 multiple choice questions in 55 minutes. The way that you go about doing that is you need to always read the source first. Like literally, depending on your knowledge of history, if you just read through what the source says, so the time period, who says it, or it sometimes gives you some extra like notes or information about it, you might be able to answer the question already. And I think like the other great test taking strategy there is that you want to make sure if it's a long quote, like if it's like a paragraph or longer, read through the questions first so that when you are going through and rereading whatever the quote says, you know what the questions are in mind so that you already have that. You don't have to like keep going back and forth between the questions and the answers or questions and the prompt, the quote. Mm. Okay. Hold on. Let me just double check a couple of things. Mm. All right, let's get right into it. You're welcome. Hopefully, you've been seeing some of my live reviews. I've been posting them all on YouTube. This is just for my Ultimate Review subscribers, packet subscribers only, because y'all deserve an extra little treat. And make sure that you throw your phone across the room, that you grab out a pencil, that you grab out some writing or some paper, and that you just take notes by hand. We're not taking notes on our computer. We're not texting on our phone. We're throwing our phone across the room. We're putting it on Do Not Disturb, because it is time to lock in, students, because your test is so soon. It's on Friday and today is Monday. So we really need to make sure that we're focused, especially this last week. And just a reminder, the fact that you're studying now is putting you ahead of probably some other people who are taking this test, because you're actually taking time to study before the test rather than just cram the night before. So let's get right into the videos. Oop, where's my picture? That's okay. It's time for Unit 9, Cold War and Contemporary Europe. Couple guiding questions for Unit 9. Unit 9 has so much information. There are 12 different topics that we need to cover in Unit 9. And it is the time that the teachers have the least amount to do anything with at the end of the year. So I have guiding questions like I always do. We're going to look at political and economic causes and effects of the Cold War. And a lot of those causes of these things in the Cold War are a direct effect of World War I or World War II. But those are two main themes we're going to hit on: political causes, political effects, economic causes, and economic effects. So if you wanted to make a chart in your notes, now would be a really helpful time. Or if you want to organize notes in whatever way makes the most sense to you, that would be great. The historical thinking skill, the main one for this unit is causation. So again, just looking at causes and effects of particular events. And then the other one is what are modern day issues faced by Europe. So the course goes through Brexit, right, which is 2016. And on your DBQs and LEQs, you can be asked anything up to 2001. And I think that it feels like it would be unkind of the College Board to ask DBQs or LEQs that are that relevant, especially because most teachers don't get all the way through this content. But you do need to know about some modern day issues faced by Europe, and I'll be really explicit to tell you what those are. For my writing questions, do I need to use fancy words? Like for your LEQ responses and DBQ responses? No, you do not. I would so much rather. It's really easy for teachers, especially like someone who's read on AP tests. It's really easy for us to figure out who is trying to use flowery language to distract us from the fact that they don't actually know what they're talking about. I would so much rather you kind of be a simple writer and just say exactly what you mean and get right to the point, versus trying to weave together this beautiful articulate story. Okay. I'm not entirely sure why none of my images are loading, but this is going to be a problem. So give me one. Watched all of that. Let's present this. Beautiful. There we go. Okay, so contextualization for this unit, which is Cold War and Contemporary Europe. World War I and World War II happened in Europe, which ushers in this age of anxiety. So this is a new time in conflict and in warfare, and people died in unprecedented amounts. And then you couple that with the fact that the Holocaust happened and now nuclear weapons exist. Europe is in an age of crisis. And that is what breeds into and leads into this Cold War, which emerges essentially right after World War II ends, right? World War II ends in Europe, May of 1945. And the Cold War starts immediately, because the Soviet Union is like, whoa, United States, what is this nuclear warfare that you have, and how can we get to be a part of it? And then you have immediately this pitting of Western democratic capitalist ideology compared to Eastern totalitarian communist ideology. And a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about in this unit really overlap a ton. So I tried to organize it in a way that makes the most sense. So we'll start out with effects of World War II, and I kind of broke it down exactly by how the College Board breaks it down when it asks us to teach this stuff. So, economic effects of World War II. World War II was disastrous for Europe, as was World War One, and a lot of these European countries that fought in the conflict no longer have the ability to literally rebuild Europe, right? Their landscape was devastated, their economies were devastated, especially after the totalitarian governments that took hold in Europe prior to and right up to World War II. Like Europe was just in shambles. So the United States Eagle Cry swoops in and says, "Hey, don't worry, Europe. Don't worry, our good Western allies. We will help you out." And the United States helps rebuild Europe, which is with what is called the Marshall Plan. And I like this map right here because it shows you how much money that the US is giving to all of these Western European countries to help them literally rebuild after the war. So this was a strategic political and economic move by the United States to say, hey, we're your allies. We're going to support you, but only if you're in this Western world, only if you're part of this like democratic capitalist world. And we're going to withhold any help from Eastern Europe over here. This is named after Senator, shoot, I don't remember who it was. It was named after a guy named Marshall, and it was $12 billion in 1945 dollars in funds to help rebuild Western Europe. And we can see that most of it goes to France and the United Kingdom. This led to an economic miracle in Western Europe, and it also leads to the rise of US culture in Europe and the rise of consumerism in Europe after World War II. So this is like a huge economic boost to these war-torn countries after World War II in Western Europe. And Eastern Europe does not receive those benefits. So almost immediately you start to see this separation between what's happening in what is prospering in Western Europe versus what is happening and kind of falling apart in Eastern Europe under the power of the Soviet Union. Also, the fact that the US can do this means that, makes capitalism and democracy look really good. And the fact that Eastern Europe is crumbling under Soviet control after this makes totalitarianism and communism look really bad. So, almost immediately after World War II, the Cold War starts. We call this the Cold War because the two major superpowers involved, the United States and the Soviet Union, don't directly fight each other. That does not mean that conflict doesn't happen. Conflict breaks out in second and third world countries across the world. I hate this terminology so much. First world means democratic and capitalist aligned. Second world means communist aligned. And third world means non aligned. So they actually didn't have sides in this Cold War, this war of ideology. And that's where all these proxy wars or limited wars or hot wars take place. So if we look at this map right here, you can see throughout the developing world, throughout South America, throughout Africa, and parts of East Asia, there are conflicts that ensue where the United States and the Soviet Union, democracy and capitalism, totalitarianism and communism, are fighting against each other. They're just not directly fighting against each other. Like the US and the Soviet Union are using Nicaragua, are using Cuba, are using places in Latin America to like have these wars to pit out which ideology is the best without directly fighting against each other. So in the Cold War, keep talking about the West and the East. The West, if we look at this map here, is really going to be Western European countries plus Turkey and Greece. Remember, fall of the Ottoman Empire, versus Eastern European countries, aka like that Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union. They begin to unify themselves through strategic political and economic alliances. So in the West, right, you see the Marshall Plan, that would kind of be an economic alliance with the United States, coupled with NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which unites these countries that are listed in green here on this map with the United States, all as this political treaty, right? If we go back to the alliance system, alliances are really helpful because the more alliances you have, the less someone's going to want to pick a fight with you, especially in the wake of World War I. And the East responds to that by two things, also an economic treaty and a political treaty. Comecon is their Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. So that, again, is like them tying their economies together. And then the Warsaw Pact would be that political military alliance. So again, almost immediately, you have a very clear version of what the West looks like, these countries here plus the United States, and what the East looks like. And it just solidifies so quickly after World War II. And that is the main division in this Cold War. This division is sometimes figuratively called the Iron Curtain. That is a term that was coined by Winston Churchill to show the division between the East and the West. It is not a literal Iron Curtain. That being said, a literal division between the West and the East during the Cold War would be the literal Berlin Wall, which was located around West Berlin in East Germany. Hopefully, your teacher has talked to you about that. Hopefully, you've seen some maps. That would be a literal division, but this symbolic division between the West and the East is going to be the Iron Curtain. So, again, here's just a fun political cartoon. I'm sure that you will have a question about the Iron Curtain or some kind of political cartoon about the Cold War that will show up on your AP Euro test. So we're going to move forward in the fall of the Soviet Union and then backtrack a little bit in time and talk about the development of the European Union, because all of this is happening at the same time, and I needed to figure out kind of a good way to talk about both of them. So if we're looking just at the Soviet Union, so that Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union is expanding its influence over Eastern Europe. If I go back to this map here, right, you have this picture of Stalin kind of posting these communist flags in these countries. He is trying to literally take over lands in Eastern Europe and say, no, 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 you are under my sphere of influence now. You are my satellite states where I can kind of do whatever I want to in you because I'm ruling by terror and by fear. Friendly reminder that Stalin's economic modernization plans and his collectivization of agriculture led to and his like purges of the kulaks, the landowning peasants, led to the deaths of like 50 to 60 million people, which is incredible. So when Stalin dies, which his death is a wild story. If we have time at the end of this, I can talk more about his death. He essentially died and people were scared to go interrupt him in his room without him knowing that they were going to interrupt. So then he was just like dead for a while before people found out. Anyway, after him came this guy, Nikita Khrushchev, who's not pictured here. This is actually Mikhail Gorbachev. Nikita Khrushchev comes to power and he's like, oh, Stalin, maybe not the best leader that we've had in like Russian or Soviet history. So he practices a movement called de-Stalinization, where he's trying to literally distance himself from the atrocities that Stalin had committed, because Stalin ruled through such an iron fist and through such fear and such terror. Khrushchev wanted to not be like that and appear better to the rest of the world, especially in the midst of the Cold War. And is Khrushchev, who is also in charge when Kennedy is the president of the United States. That's when we get to the Cuban Missile Crisis. That is the closest that the Cold War came to actually breaking out in nuclear war, now that both sides had nuclear warheads. Fast forward a couple of people after Khrushchev, and we have Gorbachev, who's pictured here. He was the leader in the late 1980s through the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. And he was best known for implementing two policies that you need to know about. One was an economic restructuring policy, which is called perestroika. And you just need to know that perestroika is economic restructuring. So he's like, hey, maybe communism doesn't work that well. What if we practice and implement some free market capitalist practices to like benefit our country? And then glasnost is clearness or openness of the media. So rather than kind of having this tight control over what was being produced or what people could say about the government, he starts to slowly loosen that. So we see Gorbachev toward the end of the Soviet Union really start to like open it up, whereas it had been kind of like tightly controlled since Stalin. And the way that you can remember perestroika and glasnost, this is so dumb, but I promise you it will work. Perestroika, Perry, I done stroika some gold. And that's how I always remember that it's economic restructuring. And then glasnost is like clearness or openness like glass. So you're opening up kind of the government political structures to be critiqued. Okay, I'm going to take a pause. I'm going to see if you have any questions. You can't see my screen. Can you still not see it? What the heck? Let's see. Let me see. Now? Mm. Hopefully working is working again. Just let me know if you need me to go back and cover anything else, but I'm going to keep trucking along because there's a lot in this unit. That is kind of what's going on in the Soviet Union. Soviet Union falls in 1991, and I'll pick up with that in a second. Let's go back to what's happening in Western Europe. So, in Western Europe, after World War II, some political leaders start to suggest ideas that would prevent war from happening again. Right? If you think about the chaos of the interwar years between World War One and between World War II, in order to prevent economic crises or prevent totalitarian leaders from coming into power, people start to say, hey, we need to just like make sure that we're taking care of the average person in Europe so that they don't become radicalized. These start to pave the way for the welfare state in Europe. And what that means is that the government is taking a bigger role in helping people out in their respective countries. So the Five Giants, which is pictured here, was proposed by this guy named William Beveridge, who was a British citizen. And he said, it is the government's duty to protect the people against idleness, want, disease, ignorance, and squalor. And if people are living kind of better, more stable lives, then that radicalism won't happen anymore. If your teachers talk to you, or if at some point in your high school career, you've talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, this is essentially saying, hey, the government needs to make sure that like people's baseline needs are met so that they can like achieve okay things in life and not turn radical. These cradle to grave welfare programs, again, is essentially just more socialist policies that governments start implementing in Western Europe specifically. So this would be, I mean, modern day examples of some things like this, you could argue would be like universal health care, free college tuition, anything like that that's promoting stability for people who are living in Western European countries. And this is received very well by a lot of people after World War II. But as time has progressed, it has had some fierce political opponents because in order to fund a welfare state, you need to raise taxes. And your teacher maybe has talked about how a lot of Western European countries now are adopting a lot of socialist policies, so they tax their citizens a lot more, but then provide their citizens with these things. And that has been met with varying degrees of anger over the course of the last couple of decades. A big proponent or a big opponent of the welfare state, especially in Britain, which is where this idea Beveridge Report stuff came from, is Margaret Thatcher. She was very anti this because she was anti taxes. Oh my gosh, we're just bouncing around everywhere. That's okay. So, World War II happens. Cold War initially starts. We got all this chaos going on over in the Soviet Union. We have some good things starting to happen in Western Europe as it is rebuilding. That's a fun difference if we think about similarities and differences. So that comparison historical thinking skill. During the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, Western Europe really starts to surpass Eastern Europe in quality of life, in technological development and innovation and industrialization, all of that. Like the Cold War really starts to split and put Western European countries way up here, while Soviet countries are like way down here. But outside of just Europe, something else that we see happen after World War II is decolonization. So European imperialism, I mean, you could argue started in the 1500s in the Americas. But then with the Berlin Conference in the 1880s, Europeans got really involved in India and Southeast Asia, and then in the continent of Africa. So after World War II, it was expensive to maintain colonies, and Woodrow Wilson's ideas of self-determination, which had been present since the 14 points after World War I, really influenced these former colonies to push for independence. So I actually hate the term decolonization. I think independence movements is much more appropriate, especially because a lot of these countries are still dealing with the effects of colonization today. But these countries in Africa and Asia and in Southeast Asia start to fight for independence and eventually gain their independence. And these fights for independence are absolutely influenced by the ideology that's happening in World War II. So the United States gets involved in a lot of these, and so does the Soviet Union, because they want to encourage the spread of their respective ideology, whether that's capitalism and democracy or totalitarianism and communism. There are some revolutions or there are some independence movements that are met peacefully, and then some are met violently. Um, India, I think, would be the best example of like a peaceful revolution, right? We all know about Gandhi and his boycotts of British goods and his eventual push for Indian independence. The nationalist movement that sticks out the most to me that was violent in Africa, that was influenced by the Cold War, that is related to decolonization, is Algeria. Speaking of nationalism, oh, students, I think that there should be an essay on nationalism. I feel like I keep saying that I think my number two essay predictions are nationalism or women, because nationalism is all over this course too. And I think it would be really mean if they were to do nationalism in like the 1900s, but I also could see that happening because it's been a really long time since they've asked a question about the 1900s. So, if we're looking at how nationalism plays out in Europe and also kind of around the world, right? Because you could talk about decolonization with nationalism. Here's what we could talk about. In Eastern Europe, in that Soviet bloc, so not the Soviet Union, but kind of those satellite buffer states that are between the Soviet Union and the rest of Western Europe, in the late 1980s, in early 1990s, I guess right around the fall of the Soviet Union, we see a couple of peaceful revolutions happen that peacefully overthrow their leader. So a great example of this would be the Czechoslovakia. They have what's called the Velvet Revolution, which is a very peaceful revolution that results in them being free. And then when the Soviet Union falls, the Czechs and the Slovaks actually part. So this was like a united front to gain independence, and then they part. There's some violent revolutions like in Hungary in the 1960s, and there's a lot of war and genocide in these former Eastern European countries. I think I have a map on this next slide. Yes, I do. Perfect. So Yugoslavia was a gigantic country that dissipated and dissolved after the Soviet Union fell. And in its dissolution, there were a couple of different genocides that occurred. The best one is going to be in Bosnia Herzegovina, or just Bosnia at the time. This was a genocide against Muslims. So maybe not often talked about, maybe forgotten about in a lot of classes, but this nationalism, this push for independence, which did lead to the dissolution of Yugoslavia and the formation of all of these states, when they were trying to refigure out those borders and refigure out the national identity of the people who are living within those borders, that occurred. Other political changes that you do need to know about, I've already talked about Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, because the Czechs and Slovaks part, Yugoslavia dissolves, Germany becomes reunited again. I'm going to take a pause. I'm going to see if you have any. No questions. Perfect. Okay. So much is going on. Let's go back and trace the steps that Western Europe took to become united. Now, we have the Marshall Plan, we have NATO, right? This is kind of the strategic military alliance, this economic support by the United States. But Western European leaders get together and say, hey, a couple of decades of war was not good for us, and we need to make sure that we are allying and uniting our economies together, because as Winston Churchill said in the 1940s, we need a United States of Europe. He said Winston Churchill argued that in order for the Europeans to prevent future war, they literally needed to integrate and become like the United States. So we see these steps toward unification, both political and military and economic unification in Europe, starting in 1947 with GATT, which is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. This actually became the World Trade Organization later on, but it is a first immediate step of them trying to unify their economies together. This was then followed by the European Coal and Steel Community, which is that second bullet point in 1952. This is integrating specifically the French and the German economic systems together, their coal and their steel resources together, because I don't know, Germany kind of was an instigator or a main fighter in World War I and World War II. And Germany liked to take it out on France. So these European leaders were like, hey, if we integrate the economies of France and Germany, maybe they won't fight against each other anymore, and maybe that will help keep peace moving forward. This was then followed by the European Economic Community, also called the Common Market, in which they all start to pull their resources together and share a common market. across their different countries. And then ultimately, in 1991, the Maastricht Treaty was signed, which led to the formation of the European Union in 1992. You could also talk about any of this stuff with increasing nationalism. The European Union and all of its other acronyms are so confusing. That's what I have on this map here, because like there's so many little caveats and like little stars of what counts as part of what area and what doesn't. All you need to know for the purpose of this test are these 4 bullet points. You don't even really need to know the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It's an illustrative example, but the European Coal and Steel Community, the European Economic Community, and the European Union are all directly from your course exam description. There are problems facing the modern day European Union. And again, if we're thinking about nationalism as a theme of this course, Brexit is a great example of nationalist problems within the European Union. As these countries start to ally themselves together politically, economically, and militarily, some argue that they start to lose their national sovereignty. They lose the ability to make their own decisions, especially because they're now governed by like a larger overhead European Union Parliament body. And this then leads to some people wanting to break away from this European Union. European Union is a supranational organization, right? So it's an organization of many countries all working together, agreeing to share things like, I don't know, a common currency with a couple of exceptions. And Britain specifically voted to break away from the European Union because they felt like they were carrying the weight, economically speaking, of a lot of the countries in Eastern Europe that were late to join the European Union who weren't pulling their weight. So that led to Britain wanting to leave, voting to leave the EU, and then kind of shocking everyone by actually voting on agreeing to leave the EU. But now there's like problems between Great Britain and like England and what Scotland wants because they're all technically part of Great Britain. Oh, so much going on. Not only that, but immigration is a huge problem facing the European Union today. When you think about the countries that Europe colonized in its imperial endeavors in the 1700s, 1800s, and kind of early 1900s, when all of those countries gained independence, a lot of those countries are like, cool, so like we were controlled by you for like 100 years, 150 years. If I'm living in Mali and France controlled and imperialized Mali during the 1800s, and Malians speak French. Do Malians now have a right to go live in France because that was like the person who colonized them? How does that work? So that is leading to increasing immigration problems in Europe from their kind of former colonies. But also, as conflict in the Middle East is increasing, a lot of people and refugees are seeking refuge in Europe. So the people who are most critical about European immigration tend to be these Atlantic countries where immigrants would come first, right? If you're coming up from Africa, you're coming up from the Middle East, you're going to hit Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal first. What else did I want to say about this? I'll stop there for now. Other problems faced by the European Union. Globalization is wild. We're all so easily connected via the internet, via telephones, via radio, via newspapers, any of that stuff. And as the West, the United States and Western Europe, becomes kind of still influential and very powerful, especially as they're developing that power over the course of the 1950s to the 2000s, consumerism really rises because people are like, hey, look at all this cool stuff that we can produce, and the West is the best, and everyone should want all of these things. So that leads to a rise in consumerism after World War II and during the Cold War, and a rise in this idea that like there's Western superiority. But this reliance on consumerism and like fast food world and globalization is now, and within the last couple of decades, being met with a rise of green parties who are urging for more sustainable development. Oh, if I could teach a class that I could just make, it would be a class on the United Nations SDGs, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which are all pictured right here. So a lot of European leaders are now facing and are forced to face the idea of like, what does it mean to continue to develop the way that we have, but in a more sustainable way? Remember, if you think about it, a lot of these Western European countries were the first to industrialize, so that they've seen the effects of that longer than people in, I don't know, the US have. So they are now more bought into wanting to adopt these sustainable development goals than compared to, let's just say, the United States. Mm, questions? Nope. Great. Love it so much. Social changes that occur in general since the fall of World War II, the end of World War II, it's like 1945 to now. Suffrage is in this unit. Women gained the right to vote prior to 1945, but it became more common, especially in like Eastern Europe after that time period. So suffrage just means that women are getting the right to vote. Not only that, women are getting access to more educational opportunities. This continues after World War II, because after World War II, more women are continually entering the workforce. But that itself, like women were expected to enter the workforce and also maintain all of their homely duties, while men were just like expected to enter the workforce. So now you kind of see this extra stress put on women, which is going to lead to certain female reformers to push for more civil rights and women's rights in Europe and across the world from the 1960s to the 1980s. So a great example of this would be Simone de Beauvoir. So she is talking about, she's ushering in second wave feminism. So rather than just like women have the right to vote now, it's like women should actually have equal political and economic rights, is that second wave of feminism. This does eventually lead to better careers and better career opportunities for women in Europe. And we can most clearly see this in the 1970s, 1980s, early 1990s by seeing that women in Europe had gained political power. Great example of this would be Margaret Thatcher, who was the Prime Minister of Britain in the 70s and early 80s. Edith Cresson was also a leader in France. And I think the other example is Mary Robinson from Ireland. I cannot believe that she is not in the CED, but Angela Merkel is the best example of this. She is one of the, however you feel about her, she, as the Prime Minister of Germany, I mean, was such a strong, formidable force in Germany and therefore in European politics from the, when did she start? Late 90s through a couple of years ago when she retired. Also, women are gaining access to reproductive rights now. And the idea of not only the fact that women can get divorced, but women can like get abortions or get birth control pills more readily are going facing a lot of problems as Europe progresses and as the second wave of feminism progresses in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Other social and cultural changes, going off of what I just said, there start to be new developments that really transcend religion and are met with a lot of people. A lot of people have very different views over this particular change that's happening in the world. So again, a really good example of this in Europe in the 80s, and honestly, like in the United States nowadays, is the idea of like this abortion debate. When is that okay? When is that not okay? All of this was happening in Europe as well, especially like when you're pairing that with more secular worldviews with a little bit of like still of a retained focus on religion. Where does abortion fit into that? Where does genetically modified or like genetic engineering fit into that? So a lot of these kind of current questions that we face in our society, these Europeans were also facing in their society a couple decades ago. Another key thing that was a social change is that the Second Vatican Council happens. So I just call this Vatican II. The Second Vatican Council was when the Catholic Church got together to rethink and maybe reaffirm some of its doctrine. And this is not related to the Second Vatican Council, but Pope Francis, I want to say like within the last couple of years has taken really drastic steps that would signal changes in Catholic practices from what had been, for the whole history of Catholicism. So he is now saying it is okay for priests, like it's okay for priests to bless same-sex marriages. So again, we see like a lot of kind of religious secular changes happening in Europe over the last couple of decades. Beautiful. If I'm looking at art, what else do I need to say here? Arts start to focus on self-expression and subjectivity. I think that this is a really fun way to end the course because if you think about the way that the course started with the Renaissance, right? There was this renewed focus on the individual and human achievement. And then all of this chaos happened for hundreds and hundreds of years. And now we're in like the late 90s, early 2000s in Europe. And again, there's like this renewed focus on like, who am I? How do I define myself? How do I express who I am? So it's almost like a new wave humanism that we see happening at after the age of anxiety and after this century of global conflict from World War I to the Cold War. A lot of new art that does emerge satirizes these traditional Western values, specifically satirizes consumerism, which is why I have this image here, and satirizes or makes fun of, critiques industrialization, mass production, kind of all of that stuff. Um, Civil rights movements happened across the world in the 1960s. So in the 1960s in Europe, you see again like a LGBTQ plus rights movement, with minority rights movement, with women's rights movements. All of that is happening across the world at the same time. And in 1968, there are student-led revolutions. These students are disillusioned by the wealth of the bourgeoisie and by like disillusioned by the high class living of the elites in society. And these student revolutions in 1968 are again like liberal revolutions that are happening in Europe, which is so interesting because again, oh my gosh, if you think about nationalism or people fighting for the rights that they want, 1848, the springtime of the peoples, 1960, like student-led revolutions, again, for more liberalism present within their regular lives because they're disenfranchised or disillusioned by like the wealth and exuberance of the upper class. Oh my gosh, okay. Perfect. I'm gonna wrap this up and then answer any questions you have. I just said so many things, and I know that I just said so many things. Unit 9 is so long. And there's just so much going on, so I hope that at least a little bit of it made sense. I know this is probably my least organized of any of my live reviews, but I hope it was at least a little bit helpful. Politically, to sum up Unit 9, the US and the USSR go head to head in the Cold War and get involved in foreign countries in order to further their specific ideologies. European countries lost their colonies around the world. In order to bring about peace in the continent, European nations took steps to ally themselves together, ultimately leading to the creation of the European Union and the Euro. You definitely need to know European Coal and Steel, European Economic Community, European Union, and now they're like very economically tied with that euro. Also, part 2, the fall of communism in the Soviet Union led to a redrawing of borders in Eastern Europe, which in some cases, like in Bosnia, led to genocide. Europe today is still facing political challenges from immigration to turmoil over what national sovereignty looks like while part of the EU, aka Brexit, to debates over social welfare programs and whether or not those should be continued or if countries need to take movements away from social policies. Culturally and economically, women, minorities, and LGBTQ plus community fought for civil rights in the 1960s and 1970s. The US influence on Europe led to increasing consumerism and globalization, which was not always received well. New technologies did increase quality of living for many, but also led to the rise in green parties who urged sustainable development. So here are my absolute must knows, and I'm just going to make sure that I've gone over each of these. And then if you have any questions about any of them, let me know. Also, now's a great time to grab your phone and take a picture of this because this stuff is directly from the course and exam description, which means that you could be tested on any of this. So World War I ends, starts the Cold War, which divides Europe / the world between the liberal democratic West and the communist East. The Marshall Plan was that $12 billion of funding that the US gave to help literally rebuild war-torn Europe, which led to a, quote, economic miracle in Europe because their economies were so revitalized by this influx of money that the US was giving them. This, of course, led to a rise in consumerism in Western Europe, not in Eastern Europe. Because in Eastern Europe, which is increasingly controlled by the Soviet Union, this Iron Curtain divides the West and the East, and the Eastern Europe are suffering with a lack of modernization and development during the same time that Western Europe is thriving. Hot wars plague the world as the US and the USSR fight each other, but not directly during the Cold War. Also, because everyone has nuclear power now, probably another global war will not happen, TBT, because we have a lot of current conflict in the world right now. GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, leads to the World Trade Organization. NATO was a political military alliance between Western countries in the North Atlantic region. This was met with the Warsaw Pact, that political alliance in the Eastern Bloc, and Comecon, which connected and helped ally and unify Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc countries' economies. Nikita Khrushchev tried to distance himself from Stalin and his atrocities. There were revolutions in the Soviet bloc in the late 80s and early 90s that led to their independence movements. I will say a really great revolution to study or look at that was also a peaceful revolution in 1989 was Solidarity, led by Lech Walesa in Poland. And that is a unique revolution because it was supported by Pope John Paul II. So there are some revolutions against communist control that are directly supported by, I don't know, the Pope of the Catholic Church in the late 1900s. New nationalisms would be what happened in the former Soviet Union as these countries start to dissolve and form new countries based on national identities. Again, you can look at, rather than it being Czechoslovakia, it splits into Czechia and Slovakia, so the Czechs and the Slovaks. War and genocide occurs as those new nationalisms break out. In Western Europe, the welfare state and cradle-to-grave social welfare programs start to emerge in order to prevent further war from happening. Mikhail Gorbachev is the leader of the Soviet Union when it falls in 1991. Part of the reason that it falls is because the space race happens and the US just literally outspends the Soviet Union, but also because of his two policies, Glasnost, which is openness, and Perestroika, which is economic recovery, both of economic restructuring. Both of those lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union, in which Germany is then united, Czechoslovakia parts, and Yugoslavia. That's not it. Don't worry. Got a whole other one. Ooh. So when we're looking at social changes, feminism is on the rise from the 1920s and the movement for suffrage in Europe to now. And women like Simone de Beauvoir start to really reconsider what motherhood, divorce, reproduction, and political office looks like for women in Europe. So those are kind of the four different factors that feminists focus on really in the 1960s to the 2000s. Decolonization occurs as European countries lose their former colonies. That is also based on Woodrow Wilson's self-determination from his 14 points after World War I. This decolonization happens because of indigenous nationalist movements. So again, I talked about Gandhi in India fighting for independence from Britain. I talked about the violence in Algeria. Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. That leads to the Vietnam War, which is directly impacted by the Soviet Union and the US's Cold War conflicts. And in Indonesia, Sukarno fights for Indonesian nationalism. Talked a bunch about ECSC and the Common Market and the European Union. Immigration to Europe is happening from these former colonies. This has been met with a lot of anti-immigration and nationalist parties. I think that's like a fun comparison to also what we see happening in the border states of the United States. I'm from Texas originally, so I pay pretty close attention to what's happening on the border of Texas. And there are huge anti-immigration pushes because, again, this influx of migrants from these war-torn regions, in the same way that Europeans are also saying, no, we don't want these migrants from these war-torn regions. There was some new medical technology that eluded consensus. People couldn't have a unified view on their view of this new medical technology, again, like genetic engineering or abortions. Globalization is increasing, consumerism is increasing, communication is now increasing all of our globalization. Literally, the AP test wants you to know about the internet and how it connects all of us together, which is hilarious. Green parties start to urge for sustainable development, and then culturally and socially, existentialism is on the rise. Why are we here? What's the purpose of us being here? This is also met with postmodernism. Postmodern views is that, like, hey, for all of history, we've learned one narrative, and maybe that one narrative wasn't actually right, and maybe we should start to incorporate other narratives into that. Great way to think about this is you just spent a year learning about European history. What if we learned about, African views on decolonization or Latin American views on decolonization to add that into our global narrative and global understanding? Vatican II, and there's the Catholic Church reforms a little bit more. Subjectivity in art. So people are like, what is everything? Who am I? How do I express myself? How do I display myself? Western values are challenged again due to sustainable development. Mass production is increasing. There's new food technology that leads to increased harvest yields. The baby boom happens after World War II, which leads to an increase in population. Civil rights movements happen in the 60s, and then the student revolutions also happen in the 60s. Oh my gosh, that's so much. Whew. What do we need? Oop, oop, everything's frozen. Yeah, what do we need? I can answer any questions you have right now for the next 6 minutes. Wednesday is going to be a writing lab, which is going to be delightful because I'm going to literally teach you how to write everything that you need to know for the AP history test, which is on Friday. What do we need? Anything? I'll hang out here. If you need anything, put anything in the chat. Ooh, I have mock AP tomorrow that counts as your final, so you need writing tips. So are you doing you're not doing the whole AP test, are you? You're doing 55 multiple choice and 3 short answer and a DBQ and an LEQ. What do you need help with specifically? Well, let me just tell you, whatever you do. Short answer questions. So you will be given on your actual AP test 3 short answer questions. First one will be a secondary source stimulus. Second will be a primary source stimulus. And the last one will have no stimulus and it'll just be pretty basic. You have, girl, you will have enough to say in your LAQ. So let me talk about how to structure an SAQ and how that then prepares you for everything. With your SAQ, directly answer the prompt with a claim. Provide specific evidence that supports that claim. Tell me the how, the why, the so what. So claim, evidence, reasoning. Maybe your teacher does topic, evidence, analysis, answer, provide, explain, answer, cite, explain. It's all the same. Just respond in 3 sentences. If you have an SAQ down, if you have that 3-sentence response down, you will achieve maximum success in your LEQ because a great body paragraph is a topic sentence, aka your claim, evidence, reasoning, evidence, reasoning. What you need to make sure that you do in your LEQ is that you can't just list evidence. You actually have to use the evidence to prove the point that you are making. What was the LEQ from the AP European history test last year or 2 years ago? It was significant. What was the most significant effect of the Protestant Reformation? I mean, what I really love about the AP wording is that there are so many ways that you can answer that question. You could say the most significant effect was literacy. You could say the most significant effect was the wars of religion that occurred. There are many correct answers rather than there just being one correct answer. All you need to do is use 2 pieces of specific evidence. LEQs are the time for you to really show what you know. And again, if we break down the rubrics of the LEQ, the rubrics of the LEQ, your contextualization is worth a point. Your thesis statement is worth a point. Your evidence is worth 2 points. Your evidence is worth 1 point. Your analysis is worth 2 points. And then your final point comes from essentially structuring the essay so that it makes sense, right? If you're talking about effects of the Protestant Reformation, the most significant effect, you can talk about the most significant effect. You can talk about the second most significant effect. You could talk about the most significant effect and also a significant cause. So a great way to think about how to be, if you have time and if you are able to do this in a way that is not confusing to you. Whatever the historical thinking skill is asking, right? If it's similarities or differences, if it's continuities or changes, if it is causes or effects, just talk about the other one as well. The complexity point is different than this year than it has been in previous years, and I think it's going to be easier to achieve this year because when I was an AP reader, I gave out. I graded like 900 essays, and I think I gave out the complexity point twice. So they changed it to make it easier. And again, a way to make it easier is that you are addressing causes and effects, continuities and changes, similarities and differences. But the key thing is that it can't just be a passing reference. It actually needs to be like a well thought out, constructed paragraph. You need to, again, prove that you know what you are talking about. And if you know what you are talking about, then that is a really close step to getting that complexity point. Another key thing is that you need to write the word because all the time. This is because, this is due to, this is an effect because, this is a cause because. You using the word because in your essay is going to force you in written form to actually articulate exactly why you're saying what you are saying. So that is going to force that reasoning piece. Use the word because all the time. Do you know if you're going to get 40 minutes for your LEQ? If you are, I think that here's my suggestion for an LEQ. It's often the one that is neglected the most. And if you can, again, get a thesis statement, if you can get a contextualization statement, and if you can provide evidence and at least a little bit of reasoning, that's 4 points. That's 4 out of 6 points right there, which is awesome. What I suggest doing before you write any essay, this is the last thing that I'll say before I head out. You need to take time to prepare. So on your DBQ portion of the AP test, you have 60 minutes and 15 of those minutes is built-in time for you to read through the documents and start to organize. And then you have 45 minutes to actually write your DBQ. With the LEQ, take 5 minutes to literally, because it's going to be really open-ended and it's going to be probably something that you absolutely know how to respond to. Take 5 minutes to think, okay, here's what I want to say. Here's maybe a counterclaim. Here are bullet pointed pieces of evidence that I want to include. Because then when you get into the midst of writing and your brain inevitably is like, what am I doing right now? You can then look back at your pre-write and say, oh yeah, this is the evidence that I wanted to include. So take the 5 minutes. Oh my gosh, take 5 minutes to just plan out where you're going before you actually start writing. And I promise it will make your life easier. Cool. Best of luck tomorrow. I hope to see you on Wednesday when I talk more about my writing lab. And I am now going to leave so that I can go to sleep because I've been awake for 15 hours.